All right, let's dive into the life of a figure who, well, needs no introduction, does she? Margaret Thatcher.
He certainly doesn't.
But we're going beyond the Iron Lady headlines, folks. We want to uncover the person, the human being, beneath that iconic image.
That's exactly right.
And for this deep dive, we're turning to the biography, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady who shaped Britain. And let me tell you, there are some surprising things in here. Stuff you might not know about her.
Absolutely. To really grasp Thatcher, you got to go back to her beginnings. This isn't some silver spoon story, a path paved to power.
Right. The book paints a picture of her childhood, and it's fascinating because, well, we're used to politicians, especially those reaching her level, coming from wealth and privilege. But she grew up, get this, living above her father's grocery store in Grantham.
And that really shaped her worldview. You know, her father, Alfred Roberts, he wasn't just a shopkeeper, a Methodist lay preacher, a local politician himself. The book emphasizes his values. Hard work, thrift, self-reliance, instilled in her that belief you don't just float along in life.
You got to make things happen.
Precisely.
So it wasn't just like stocking shelves and counting pennies. It was absorbing these values that become the foundation of her whole political philosophy later on.
Yeah, that's the point. It's like those years above the shop were a training ground for the political battle she'd fight later.
It's kind of wild to think the future prime minister was once a little girl learning the value of a pound, helping out in her dad's store.
Worlds away from 10 Downing Street, isn't it?
Absolutely. Now, the book also mentions she was a bright student, excelled in school, and get this, she loved acting.
Oh, yeah.
Even played the Fairy Queen in a school play. Who knew?
It's a small detail, but I think it reveals something. Even then, she wasn't afraid of the spotlight. To lead, to command attention.
I love those little insights into her personality. It makes her seem more, I don't know, human, less like the Iron Lady caricature we're so used to.
Absolutely. And remember, this was a time when women's roles were far more limited, So her ambition, her drive, that was even more remarkable.
Which brings us to her going to Oxford to study chemistry.
Right. Not exactly the typical path for, well, someone who would lead the country one day.
Not at all.
It wasn't just a love of science, though. It was about proving herself in a field dominated by men, succeeding on her own terms.
She wasn't one to follow convention. She was forging her own path. So picture this. Future prime minister, young woman in the lab, conducting experiments.
That analytical mind, that scientific approach, it'll later be applied to her political decisions, too.
The book even says she worked as a research chemist for a bit, contributing to the development of soft-serve ice cream.
Really?
Yep. It's amazing, right? It shows a different side of her.
Definitely. But even while doing that, her interest in politics was growing.
And in 1959, she gets elected to Parliament, representing Finchley, the start of her political career.
And she rose quickly, impressed her colleagues with her intellect, her powerful speeches, especially on economic matters.
Clearly a fast learner, mastering all the ins and outs of policy, parliamentary procedure.
Ambitious, determined to make her mark.
And she did just that when she was appointed Education Secretary in 1970.
By Prime Minister Edward Heath, right. A turning point.
Her first major cabinet position, a chance to put her ideas into practice.
Absolutely.
And this is where we hit the infamous milk snatcher episode.
Ah, yes. The decision to cut funding for free school milk.
It's interesting how a seemingly small policy had such a lasting impact on her image,
It became a symbol, right, of her tough, no-nonsense approach, cutting costs. Media loved it, and that nickname, Milk Snatcher, it stuck. Really foreshadowed the kind of leader she'd become, willing to make unpopular decisions if she thought they were for the greater good.
It makes you think, does a leader have to be liked to be effective?
That's a great question. It's something to ponder, isn't it? This early controversy, did it color people's perceptions of her later decisions? Worth considering.
For sure. So even in these early years, we see what'll become Thatcherism taking shape. But what does that even mean exactly?
Thatcherism wasn't just about, economic policies. It was a whole philosophy. Individual responsibility, free markets, limited government. This idea that people should be empowered to succeed or fail on their own merits. Minimal government meddling. And it resonated with a lot of folks who felt the welfare state had gotten bloated, inefficient.
So it was a radical shift from the prevailing political consensus of the time.
Oh, absolutely. And it'd have a huge impact, not just on Britain, but the whole world.
Wow. But before we get to that, let's talk about her rise to the top job. The Conservatives lose the 1974 general election. Edward Heath's leadership is challenged.
Right. And in a move nobody saw coming, Thatcher challenges Heath for leadership of the party and wins.
Think about that. First woman to lead a major political party in the UK.
A pivotal moment not just for her, but for British politics as a whole.
Many doubted her. Some even predicted she'd destroy the Conservative Party.
But she had this clear vision, a powerful message, an unwavering belief in herself.
And a few years later, 1979, she leads the Conservatives to victory in the general election, becomes Britain's first female prime minister.
It was historic, the beginning of a new era.
So she's prime minister, a conservative through and through. What was first on the agenda?
Transformation, a complete overhaul of Britain's economy. She saw that as the key, to restoring the nation's prosperity, its place in the world.
And this is where her belief in free markets, limited government, really comes into play.
Oh, absolutely. One of her big strategies was privatization, selling off state-owned industries to private companies. Controversial, sure, but she argued it'd make those industries more efficient, more competitive.
But how does that actually work? Like selling something like, say, British Telecom to private investors, how's that lead to better phone service?
Well, think of it this way. When the government runs everything, there's no incentive to improve, to offer better prices, because there's no competition. Privatization, it injects that competition. Companies got to fight for your business by offering better services, lower costs. Of course, it's not always that simple in reality.
Right. The book does mention that privatization led to some job losses in certain sectors.
Yeah, that's one of those trade-offs that often comes with this kind of economic restructuring. Some argue those job losses were balanced out by job creation in other areas. It's complicated, no easy answers.
So benefits and drawbacks to privatization, both sides of the coin?
Exactly. Gotta look at it from multiple perspectives.
Another major thing was Thatcher curbing the power of trade unions.
This was key for her, to reduce the influence of what she saw as, well, vested interests that were holding back economic growth. She felt unions had become too powerful, their demands were pushing wages up, making British industries uncompetitive.
And this leads to the miners' strike of 84-85, one of the most defining and controversial moments of her time in office.
The miners' union, they were a force to be reckoned with. Their leader, Arthur Scargill, charismatic, confrontational. The book really captures how intense this clash was. Two strong personalities head-to-head, a battle of wills that changed Britain's industrial landscape forever.
The strike lasted almost a year. Devastating impact on mining communities, unemployment, social unrest.
A bitter, drawn-out struggle, a real turning point in British industrial relations. Thatcher's victory marked a decline in union power that, well, we're still seeing the effects of today.
So she was willing to take on powerful groups in her pursuit of economic reform, even if it came at a high cost for some. Progress can be painful sometimes, I guess.
That's the question, isn't it? Balancing economic efficiency with social justice. Age-old problem.
No easy solutions. Now, Thatcher wasn't just about economics. She was a social conservative too, right?
Oh, definitely. Traditional values, strong sense of national identity, tough on law and order. Her supporters, they saw it as common sense, a rejection of, what they perceived as the excesses of the 60s and 70s. Critics saw it as a step backwards, reinforcing outdated norms.
So a polarizing figure even then.
Absolutely. And that only intensified with how she handled the Falklands War in '82.
A defining moment for her on the world stage. Argentina invades the Falklands, a British territory, and Thatcher responds decisively, sends a task force, a naval one, to take those islands back. A gamble, for sure.
And it paid off. The British victory in the Falklands, it boosted her popularity at home, solidified that image of her as a strong, resolute leader, changed how Britain saw itself in the world, too.
The book talks about how the war restored a sense of national pride, a purpose, after years of economic woes and social divisions. A unifying moment, people putting differences aside.
Of course, there are those who say the war was unnecessary, could have been avoided with diplomacy. But for Thatcher, it was about principle, defending British sovereignty, showing British strength.
So we have this contrast. At home, controversial policies, dividing the nation. On the world stage, projecting strength and resolve.
That's one of the paradoxes of her leadership.
Speaking of the world stage, one of the most interesting parts of the book is about her relationship with Ronald Reagan. Ideological soulmates, you could say.
Oh, yeah. They shared that belief in free markets, small government, a tough stance against the Soviets. Political soulmates. The term gets thrown around a lot.
The book describes it as mutual respect, admiration. They talked a lot. on everything from arms control to economics.
Both of them were transformative, leaders who reshaped the political landscapes of their countries and the world.
But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The book mentions Thatcher wasn't so keen on Reagan's Star Wars idea, the Strategic Defense Initiative. Thought it was too provocative, could mess up the balance of power with the Soviets.
Shows she was willing to speak her mind, even to a close ally. She wasn't afraid to disagree with Reagan, and he respected that. Their relationship, it was complicated. Shared ideology, but also pragmatic diplomacy.
And then there's her relationship with Gorbachev, the Soviet leader who brought in perestroika and glasnost. Quite different from Reagan.
On the surface, yeah, total opposites. Staunch conservative, reformist communist. But Thatcher, she was one of the first Western leaders to see Gorbachev's potential for change.
The book quotes her famous line, "We can do business together." Pretty remarkable considering her anti-communist stance.
Shows she was a pragmatist too, not just driven by ideology. If she thought it was good for Britain, she'd engage, even with adversaries.
And some argue that she played a big part in ending the Cold War, encouraging Gorbachev's reforms, paving the way for the Soviet Union to eventually collapse. Quite a legacy.
A fascinating chapter in her story, that's for sure. But her time at the top, it wouldn't last forever.
Right. Her third term, it's marked by growing unpopularity and dissent within her own party.
And then you have the community charge, better known as the poll tax. That was a turning point.
This was, what, a flat tax on every adult, regardless of income?
The idea was to make local government more accountable, in theory. But in practice, it was seen as unfair, hit low-income households hardest.
People were not happy.
Protests, even riots in some cities, backfired, big time. I mean, it does seem out of character for Thatcher, She usually had such sharp political instincts.
So what happened?
Some say the poll tax was a blunder, a miscalculation. She didn't read the public mood right. Others argue it was bold, a flawed attempt, but an attempt nonetheless to really reform local government. What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely hurt her image. That Iron Lady persona, it was starting to crack.
And the poll tax, it emboldened her critics within the Conservative Party. They sensed weakness, started questioning her leadership more openly.
And then comes the leadership challenge in November 1990. It's almost Shakespearean. A leader brought down not by, enemies from the outside, but by her own side.
The book captures that drama so well, all the behind-the-scenes stuff, the deals, the shifting alliances, and then Thatcher realizing she just doesn't have the support to stay on.
I can't even imagine how that must have felt after all those years at the top, to be pushed out by your own party.
The book describes her resignation speech, and you can sense it, the betrayal, the disappointment. It was the end of an era.
So after more than 11 years, Thatcher's out. What does she do next?
Retired from politics, but she was still a presence, a vocal one. Wrote her memoirs, gave lectures, kept championing the causes she believed in.
The book mentioned she was especially active on the international stage, speaking out on stuff like the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, the importance of, the transatlantic alliance.
Never one to shy away from her views, even after leaving office.
But as you said earlier, she remained a divisive figure. People still argue about her legacy even today.
That's what happens with leaders who really shake things up. They leave a lasting impact, good and bad. Supporters see her as this visionary who rescued Britain from economic ruin. Critics say her policies made inequality worse, created a more divided society.
And those debates are still going strong. It's amazing. Shows how significant she was, how much she changed things.
She was complex, a walking contradiction, someone who defied easy labels. That's what makes her story so captivating, I think. A trailblazer, a conviction politician, a leader who left her mark on Britain, on the world.
Well, we've covered a lot, haven't we? From those humble beginnings above that grocery store to the turbulent years as prime minister and everything in between. Margaret Thatcher clearly was so much more than just the Iron Lady.
She was a product of her time, shaped by the forces reshaping Britain after the war. But she also shaped those forces, right? Her legacy is still being debated today, and that's something.
It's been quite a journey. We looked at her personality, her beliefs, her wins, her losses. And I think we have a better understanding now of the woman behind the myth.
But this is just a starting point. There are so many books, articles, documentaries out there exploring different aspects of Thatcher's life, her impact. I encourage you, keep learning, keep asking questions, keep diving deeper into these stories history has to offer.
That's what it's all about, right? Sparking that curiosity, encouraging you to learn more, come to your own conclusions. So keep at it, and until next time, folks.